because I saw that the mainstream media was not covering this. And that to me was very eerie. It infuriated me that our leaders had just condemned people to essentially starve for the first time in history. China might be deliberately influencing this. Now we know that it was all just theater.
They have these videos of people just collapsing on the street.
Which mysteriously appeared all over the international internet right around the time that Wuhan locked down. The only way to stop it was just Chinese totalitarianism.
You bring up the fact that they're wearing masks, and I'll go into a restaurant with my mask on. As soon as I get to the table, I take it off. How do we get back to normal?
The reason they love these mask mandates is that they spread anxiety, they spread fear.
Welcome back to Generally Speaking. I'm your host, General Spalding, and I'm here with Michael Senger, who is what I consider to be a part of the Fourth Estate. He is a Twitter influencer, but he's also working to expose the Chinese Communist Party's influence on our society. And it's in a very interesting way. I became aware of Mike through his efforts on exposing a lot of the influence that the Chinese Communist Party has placed within our medical institutions. And so we're going to talk about a letter that he helped put together, and I'm really excited, and I think you're going to enjoy the conversation. And let's welcome Mike Senger to the program. You wrote this letter, and you kind of contacted me out of the blue and said, hey, would you take a look at this? So can you explain a little bit about the letter that you put together and how long you worked on it, because it's, I think with citations, it's like 150 pages when I paste it into a Word doc. So it's a pretty. It's more than a letter. It's kind of like a report, a pretty interesting report. But how did you come about to do that, and who did you enlist to help?
Right. Thanks, General. So it's really kind of a long story. This caught my interest as soon as the world started shutting down. Before that, I didn't really know much about Chinese influence. Like for the vast majority of people, it's very sort of hidden. You don't really know about it until you get into this community and something sort of draws you in, whether it's military experience or some kind of experience with the intelligence community or some kind of experience in journalism that really triggers this interest and you start digging deeper into it. But when I saw one country after another start to shut down like this in March, and sort of this very eerie way of just stop all economic activity. And, when Italy did it, I'm like, okay, that's strange. Maybe I didn't know as much about Italy as I thought. Then when I saw United States and the United States doing it, you see California shutting down. And to me, it's like, wait a minute, that is totally antithetical to everything the United States is about, especially a Western state like California. I mean, that just has nothing to do with the history of this sort of Wild West state to just have the government forcibly shut down all economic activity. So I immediately knew that was, a very strange thing to happen. And then as I saw this policy spread to developing countries, you see countries in Africa shut down, India shuts down. And at that point I knew, these leaders are essentially just condemning people to starve. Like this is very wrong. Something has to be wrong here. They got something very wrong. And that got me researching, digging deeper into this, and realizing that this was not all above board. And of course, by that point, it was already sort of common knowledge that the Chinese Communist Party had a lot of influence in the World Health Organization. And so this hypothesis formed very early that they might be using this, China might be influencing this pandemic response. And so I got involved in the sort of anti-lockdown community because I saw that the mainstream media was not covering this. And that to me was very eerie. And of course, at first I just thought it was groupthink. I thought they were being woke. They were being sort of patriotic by just buying into these lockdowns without any sort of real debate in the mainstream media. Before this, I was just sort of your typical liberal, very sort of left-wing professional. I would read the New York Times, the Economist, the Wall Street Journal. That was really all the social media interaction I ever did, just commenting on, mainstream sites. But it infuriated me that our leaders had just condemned people to essentially starve, just destroyed everyone's livelihoods for the first time in history. This had never happened before. And there was no debate about this. That struck me as just, you know, I mean, I could never even imagine anything like that happening. So, and I heard that started to hear about others who had this same reaction that I did, that I was not alone in this, that Michael Burry, the genius from The Big Short, he was an early sort of whistleblower that, in his mind, he's slightly autistic. For him, he immediately realized that the effects of this were going to be absolutely catastrophic. This would be the most catastrophic policy decision that he'd ever seen in his lifetime. So I joined Twitter, started following him, started following others in the anti-lockdown community. Alex Berenson is a former reporter for the New York Times, has been very active. But I think for most of the anti-lockdown community, especially in the early days, there was a real feeling that this was just sort of a scientific mix-up. Like the scientists, they got this wrong. They didn't realize how widespread the virus was. They thought this was going to work, and we just show them data, we clear this up, and we go on our way. Like this is just this big mistake, and that's it. And I wasn't so sure. And in the beginning, that was a sort of radical view that China might be deliberately influencing this. And so I started getting more involved in the China watching community on Twitter as well. And so I sort of bridged those two communities, which very few people were doing, getting involved with intelligence folks, China experts, started following them. Folks in the Hong Kong movement was very big back then, and started learning much more about the way that China had been sort of buying up um, influence in universities, think tanks, mainstream media, and essentially sort of warping the truth over a very long term in their favor. And that sort of started to explain, how they might be influencing this across the entire world with so little debate, this pandemic response. And then around sort of May, June, there was a real smoking gun where the New York Times wrote a really good expose of a lot of the propaganda um, that China was putting out on social media. And it doesn't seem like the authors of the New York Times article really understood exactly what they had found. But it turns out if you dig deeper into this article, into their sources, you find just thousands and thousands of these tweets, essentially sort of, saying, hail China's lockdown policy, like praising China's lockdown policy, and sort of denigrating leaders across the entire world for not implementing these policies. And so I dug deeper into that and started doing these sort of bot maps of all these, fake accounts that were essentially promoting lockdowns all across the world with all these different leaders and pressuring leaders to implement these. And that was sort of the initial thread I did. And I started my account sort of for that specific purpose of trying to say, China might be deliberately using propaganda to promote this. And from there, it kind of one thing led to another. I started getting deeper into it, and obviously, it's not just propaganda; it's the influence they have in public health as well. And it turns out that a lot of the scientific journals, I started uncovering scientific journals and getting in contact with people who were involved in the scientific community. Some investigative journalists started sending me some information about some of the initial scientific journals with the recommendations for putting people on ventilators way too early, which could be very deadly. Those recommendations all came from China. The idea that this was a novel virus, which is dubious. It's really just kind of an ordinary coronavirus. That concept came from China. That idea came from China. The entire idea of lockdown had absolutely no precedence within public health. It was not part of any of our pandemic playbooks. And, the United States and the United Kingdom were ranked, on the very top in terms of pandemic preparedness. But the idea of lockdown had never been taken seriously. It was just utterly dismissed until Xi Jinping, General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, ordered it. And immediately when he did, the Health Organization was just besides themselves. This is the greatest policy ever. They didn't even have any results to show for this lockdown. She had just locked everybody into their homes, sealed people's doors shut, often without enough food. There were big protests in Wuhan. Um, but the World Health Organization thought this was the greatest thing ever. And as soon as, you know, the Chinese Communist Party started saying, "Oh, we flattened the curve," and the data is obviously forged. but the representative from the World Health Organization in China uh, announced that this is a huge success and recommended the entire world follow this. And now we know that it was all just theater. Like we have many, many studies showing that the coronavirus is always already very widespread across many countries by the end of 2019. And this Wuhan lockdown did not even go into effect until January, late January. So this is just all theater. Um, and it I mean, we don't know if it actually accomplished anything. Probably didn't accomplish anything. There's one city in China that shut down, and this was laundered into public health policy based on that one city, and the entire world was ordered to do this, and everyone fell in line, and that's really how much influence the Chinese Communist Party has, and I mean, it's just it's baffling to me that they have that much influence. I think that's extraordinarily scary.
What part did your legal training play in kind of how you researched this? And it's, like I said, it's a very well cited paper. Extensive citations in it where you show, for example, Imperial College of London and their initial test, or not test, but their report on the potential threat of over 2 million Americans dying was so widely off the mark. And it was interesting to note that in, I think, 2015, Xi Jinping himself visits Imperial College and gives them a big grant for doing things like epidemiological research. So, what role did your background have in legal training to begin to research this, and who did you enlist to help out?
Yeah, yeah, that is a funny story with Imperial College. No, I think my legal training definitely has helped in that sense of just um quality of evidence and gathering evidence. Yeah, it's very clear when you read the letter that everything is cited, every single point of evidence is cited meticulously. Almost every sentence is cited. That's very common in legal writing, because when lives are in the balance, when you're arguing in front of a judge, you can't just say something. Everything has to be true. It has to be very meticulously cited because there's somebody on the other side arguing the exact opposite thing. So if they can point a hole in something and say you didn't cite that, you don't have evidence for that, they will say so. So, my sources sort of send me stuff all over the place. And I'd say, 90% of what I do is filtering out what is high enough quality to actually be evidence. And ultimately, that letter is, I mean, if I included everything that I had from everywhere, and a lot of it is sort of mostly circumstantial evidence, things that are almost, sort of borderline conspiratorial. But I mean, it would not be 100 pages, it would be 1,000 pages. So a lot of what I do is sort of filtering that stuff out. And I think my legal training has helped me a lot in that. And also, I was an auditor before doing law. Um, I do have a specific background that might have been sort of why me. People have often asked why me, why has this apparently sort of evaded a lot of the intelligence community, which is a story in itself. And sort of, you are the one to, if this is real, if the Chinese Communist Party is influencing the world's pandemic response, why are you the one to be sort of the champion of this cause? Um, and I think it's because I have a sort of background in economics, background as an auditor, just sort of background doing this type of forensic investigative work, and also a background in law and working at this quality of evidence and doing this type of legal writing. So I do, in some ways, sort of have that unique set of skills that might have just sort of made me attuned to this. So yeah, with Imperial College, that was a big part of the story, and it's easy to forget, but this is not a connection that most people had made several months ago. Actually, when I first started um, reporting on China's propaganda, the lockdown propaganda, a lot of folks would say, "Well, I don't know how much influence that would really have, these online propaganda campaigns. What really did the trick was Neil Ferguson's model, the Imperial College model, predicting all these deaths." And so
That scared people. That terrified people.
they started people. And you have that sort of multi-tiered approach where at the sort of base emotional level, you have the propaganda that comes right through people's screens of saying like, in 10 days you're going to be just like Italy, you're going to have overrun hospitals, you have to do what China did, and look at China, how great that is, and
And then they have these videos of people just collapsing on the street, right? They just collapse on the street.
yep, just over a year ago, people are now bringing back those images of people collapsing on the street in China, which mysteriously appeared all over the international internet right around the time that Wuhan locked down. Sites that are all blocked in China. So I don't know how you explain that. And of course, a year later, that has not happened anywhere else in the world. It was all theater for which audience? I mean, given that it was released all over the world, apparently an international audience, and that in a lot of ways kind of tells you everything you need to know right there. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party was trying to scare the world with this propaganda. But anyway, so it's a
Well, how so?
multi-tiered approach, and so people question sort of how effective would that propaganda be by itself, and that's true. But it was not just propaganda. You had the models as well, and you had the scientific journals. So folks were asking, well, what about that initial model? It seems like that was really sort of the biggest factor in scaring the entire world and the shutting down. And so I started looking more into Imperial College, and some folks had alerted me to the fact that Imperial College actually has a very special relationship with China. Of any, you know, university in the Western Hemisphere, Imperial College has the closest relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. And as you said, in 2015, Xi Jinping actually took a very short trip to the United Kingdom, only 4 days. His only trip to the United Kingdom as General Secretary, and happened to make a big stop at Imperial College to announce all these new collaborations in public health and biological research that are very much on point here. So, I mean, what does that tell you? And to this day, Imperial College still announces that they have this very close relationship with China, very close collaborations with China, and gets a lot of their funding from China, in all sorts of ways. So very telling, because throughout this entire crisis, the models coming out of Imperial College have been wildly off the mark. They have been far and away the most inaccurate, and a study from UCLA proved this. That compared the accuracy of various mainstream universities and institutions models of predicted deaths, and Imperial colleges are just always far too high. So always off, and not just always off, but always off in one direction of being far too alarmist and far too high. And they happen to have this very special relationship with China. Um, I can't go. I am not a police officer. I cannot go question people, but I don't understand why you would not, because that to me is a very strange connection there. And so I hope somebody looks more into that.
So when people look at you, and particularly after this comes out, and now that you're, a Twitter influencer, do you get the impression that they think that you're some kind of crackpot or a tinfoil hat wearing person? I mean, have people come after you? Have the Chinese come after you? I mean, what's been, how has your paper been received?
So it's been received very well. The response has been very positive. I can't say, it's still not considered mainstream. And especially in the early days, when I was just researching the propaganda, that was a very common response, that very dismissive. The world did not shut down because of a bunch of tweets, and that's true. It wasn't a bunch of tweets, and that's why I went on from writing just about propaganda to this letter detailing all the scientific fraud that took place in all the science journals on asymptomatic spread, the initial PCR test genomes coming from China. I mean, everything we know about this virus, the entire response has come from China. They, had that controlled the initial information about this virus, and everything, our entire response, from lockdowns to the PTR test to the idea that was novel and asymptomatic spread, all came from the Chinese Communist Party. And that's not good, given that this is well known to be a totalitarian country now. So initially, I think people thought it was maybe a little, out there to think that the Chinese Communist Party was, um, deliberately manipulating this because initially I think most folks who are against lockdowns just thought it was a scientific misunderstanding and that if we just clear up the science and we have enough charts and graphs making this very clear that lockdowns are not good, that will change things. Um, and that has not turned out to be the case. And that is why my following has grown so much over the past several months, because I think it's become more and more clear to anybody with their eyes open that our leaders are, for one reason or another, using this pandemic to turn the world into China. Um, now they've introduced tracing apps. They've introduced the idea of mandatory vaccines in a lot of countries. They've introduced, vaccine passports. They call them freedom passes in the United Kingdom, which is an idea that comes straight from Xi Jinping. He wants to set up this world global, you know, um, biometric database. We have censorship, we have propaganda, we have these massive civil attacks, we have the idea of lockdown itself, which came straight from Xi Jinping, has now become this, common idea. Everybody walks around with masks. It just obviously came from China. So it's become more and more clear to folks that, you know, our leaders are turning us into China. And folks want to know why that is. There's still a lot of people who think this is just, public health people being a bit gullible. Um, Still just kind of a scientific misunderstanding. They think like, hey, this worked in China, and so we should probably try it here. I think given the level of sycophancy I see from a lot of folks in public health toward China, I think there's a bit more to it than that. Especially some of the quotes you see the World Health Organization just bending over backwards to praise China for its lockdowns, very prematurely announcing that it was a success when that was obviously not true, when it's very clear to anybody that the virus is still spreading around China. You have the editor in chief of the world's premier medical journal, The Lancet, saying, just very sycophantic article that had absolutely nothing to do with public health, saying that all of China's leaders have had the interest of securing the territorial integrities secured by Mao Zedong. It was just the very strange pro CCP article that the Global Times could have written. So I mean, it's to me it's very clear that you have this virus from China, um, and a public health response from China that is turning the world into China. And it's considered sort of mainstream to think that China is not deliberately influencing that. That you have this very prosperous totalitarian country, very powerful totalitarian country that is not influencing the fact that the entire world is being turned into China. And I find that actually to be the absurd argument here. Um, when you look at what has happened over the past year, what you've seen is the sort of mainstream embrace of what is essentially science fiction. The idea that you have this super virus out there that might have come from a lab and we don't know if it's a bioweapon or not, but it's the only way to stop it was just Chinese totalitarianism. The great Chinese government was the only super government great enough to beat this virus with this super lockdown that they had in Wuhan. And so everybody has to do exactly what they did. And they have to have the lockdown, they have to have masks, they have to have mass testing and tracing and quarantine centers. That is science fiction. We have plenty of data, just very self-explanatory charts that show that this is a very ordinary coronavirus. We should never have abandoned our very sort of light touch public health plans that we had centuries of research proving that was the best method. Just wash your hands, basic hygiene, protect the vulnerable. That was what public health was always about. We had absolutely no reason to abandon that. And the reason we did was, frankly, the influence of the Chinese Communist Party. And the results have been absolutely catastrophic. It's been the greatest crime of the 21st century. So, you know, the mainstream has embraced the science fiction story of the super virus. The real story is, you know, has something that happened all throughout history. It's straight out of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. The tyrant instructed his cronies to suspend everyone's rights, and that's exactly what they did. I mean, these people are in the Chinese Communist Party's pocket one way or the other. or they're being influenced through various vestiges of the Chinese Communist Party, and have convinced people that they have to give up all their rights to fight this virus. And unfortunately, that's been extraordinarily effective. And the only way to fight back is to bring the truth to light about what's really happened here.
So obviously the medical industry, CDC, World Health Organization, are highly influenced by the pharmaceutical industry. Of course, we know the pharmaceutical industry itself. There was Drugs Inc. I think that was written about all the precursors, and just about every pharmaceutical is manufactured in China. So there's a tight tie between the Chinese Communist Party and the pharmaceutical industry. So, in your mind, is it more this effect of their influence on the pharmaceutical industry, who then imparts its influence on the medical industry, with regard to like the CDC and WHO, or is it also direct influence of those organizations through collaboration at a government level?
Yeah. No, that's where it gets very tricky, is exactly how the narrative is sort of being spun and being controlled, and exactly who's doing it. Now, there's absolutely no question that the Chinese Communist Party has been very active in co-opting scientific institutions and also the vaccine industry. I think there's been reports out of several countries. One that I recall is Canada, a collaboration between China and Canada, and it turns out that it was part of the United Front, the Thousand Talents program, where the heads of this um, company, this vaccine company, were actually co-opting people to work for the Chinese Communist Party. So there's no question that the Chinese Communist Party has been very active in influencing this area. Now, a lot of this is also companies doing what's in their own financial self-interest. There's absolutely no question about that. And that's a common sort of, every day I get posts about how, oh, it's not just the CCP, it's also, you know, the World Economic Forum, it's, all these corporations doing what's in their own interest. That is absolutely right. There's no question that once lockdowns started steamrolling, and big corporations started profiting at the expense of small businesses, a lot of corporations jumped on board, and that, combined with sort of the influence that the Chinese Communist Party has in these organizations, and also them sort of protecting their financial interests in China, have made them, in some ways, since the ball actually got rolling, almost sort of indistinguishable from the Chinese Communist Party, because they're pursuing what's in their own financial self-interest. And once that idea of lockdown becomes normalized, then often what is in their financial self-interest is contrary to what is really in the interest of the people's rights. Um,
By the way, this is what I back in 2014 when I was studying, and I had a team of folks, officers, studying the Chinese Communist Party at the Pentagon. This was the thing that I realized, was that because we had opened up our society and allowed them to come in, that they had shifted the incentive system away from where a U.S. company was incentivized to do things in the common good by the rules and laws of our system. And in actuality, with globalization and openness, we had allowed them to essentially take over that incentive system to drive company behavior that was in the interest of the Chinese Communist Party by, one, the market pool of 1.4 billion consumers, and also the financial incentives, through Chinese capital, like investment. And so it's absolutely not surprising to me. I think what surprised me, and I was aware of the tweeting, and I was aware of all of the wolf warrior diplomacy and all the propaganda that went around the coronavirus. But what really impressed me about your report was that you took the time to show also the influence that the Chinese Communist Party had on the reporting, on the dealing with the virus, on the pharmaceutical industry. And it really was the first time comprehensively you began to see how this works across an entire industry. And that's because I'd seen it in a microcosm before, and I understood that it existed in the macro. But your report was the first time that I actually understood, okay, here's how it all works and how it all fits together in a macro sense for this one specific industry. I literally heard from billionaires, and this was before, long before the coronavirus in 2020, here in the United States, that our system of government has failed. We need to adopt the Chinese system of government. So it's not surprising to me that this would actually be, people would say, oh, they've got a much better system of government. One party controls everything. And if you look in our system, the two parties, essentially fight each other and say, each party wants the ability to have what the Chinese Communist Party has, which is total control over the society. And so it's not a surprise to me that they have, really, enjoyed this kind of newfound power that they got because of the coronavirus. So are you doing anything in the legal sphere, or are you just focused mainly on kind of the educational part of it, this report, tweeting, or are you actually working to fight some of these cases through the legal system?
I personally am not. Some of my colleagues are, but to me, it's really the geopolitical aspect that interests me the most, the influence of China in particular. And that's not something that's really conducive to being dealt with through courts. I mean, frankly, the Chinese Communist Party is kind of above the law in that sense. That's
Right.
that's the problem. That's the
I
big
can
problem.
tell you some stories about that.
Right, right. Um, there is a case that people are talking about filing a big civil case, suing China for all the damage that has been done through these lockdowns. But that is a quixotic case. That's not really.
Right.
It's more about bringing attention. It's just another way of bringing attention. I'd rather just sort of report on this and sort of the geopolitical aspect and shed light on that. There's other attorneys, some I'd say older, more experienced attorneys are actually dealing with the more domestic side, suing companies
Right.
for these tests and hoping to get some profitable class action lawsuits. That's kind of doesn't interest me as much. I think it's very profitable, also very time consuming. I mean, but if you're the type of attorney who's used to going up against giant corporations and big class action lawsuits, potentially very profitable to go into. And that'll be an essential part of the process of getting back to normal and shedding light on this catastrophe is those big civil class action suits. That to me is not as interesting as sort of what's going on geopolitically. To me, the big story is that this has shed light on how much influence the Chinese Communist Party has. There are people who, yourself and others who, a very niche community who is aware of this for one reason or another. I had absolutely no idea that the Chinese Communist Party had this much influence in our world. But I mean, this is the real wake up call. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party just shut down the world. Like, you know,
I like Have you seen the Pitbull interview when when he says they took control of the world with a virus? I mean, it was a really powerful interview. He comes from communism, and he's like, I see what's going on here, and he's a real, of course, a popular figure. But when people like that begin to see it and speak out about it, I'm hopeful that we're nearing kind of the end of this madness where people are going to wake up and realize. But you mentioned something early in the interview about the intelligence community, and I can tell you, having worked a lot with the intelligence community in my time in uniform, that when it comes to this, they are completely clueless, because the things that you researched and looked at are not the things that they research and look at. And certainly that's been one of the problems with our intelligence community, is that they haven't been tied into, in many cases, because they're prevented from looking at our own society. And so when you can't look at our own society and see the implications of Chinese influence within it, then you tend to not have the ability to kind of warn us. And this has been, I think, the big challenge within Washington, D.C., because, like at the National Security Council, any National Security Council meeting, the first thing you're going to get is an intelligence briefing. What does the intel community think about A, B, or C? In this case, they didn't even it was entirely within the National Institute of Health and the CDC. It wasn't within the intelligence community. They I think in many respects completely missed this. So it's almost you're providing. I said the fourth estate, which pertains to the press, but it's almost you're almost doing an intelligence community effort here to identify this type of bad behavior that's a national security challenge within our own society. One of the things that I saw in Taiwan, and I actually got the coronavirus in Taiwan in late January of 2020, and I was there to monitor elections. They had established non-governmental organizations that were designed to focus on Chinese influence within Taiwan. In addition, they were some of the first to react to the coronavirus, but they didn't react in the way that the Communist Party did. They basically did exactly what you said. It told people to voluntarily wash your hands, social distance, use masks, whatever. Made them aware, but there was no lockdown. There to this day has never been a lockdown in Taiwan. So I think in terms of the intelligence community and non-governmental organizations, how do you if you're not going to attack this from the courts, how do we establish this more permanent presence of the fourth estate has failed? I mean, clearly, Veritas goes around trying to do its bit. You've done, I think, a noble effort here. But by and large, the media is not the media anymore. How do we create this real kind of non-governmental organization or organizations that are focused on alerting our society to things that happen as a condition of globalization and the internet, where we are interlinked with particularly totalitarian societies that have an interest to undermine our democracies?
I mean, it's a great question. I don't know if I have all the answers. I mean, I agree 100% that this is first and foremost an intelligence failure. I think lockdowns are first and foremost a crime, an unprecedented crime and a fraud, and also first and foremost an intelligence failure. The big reason that I think most people are going along with it is they think that if there was anything untoward about it, the intelligence community would say so. And that just sort of feeds on itself. I think scientists think, well, if the Chinese Communist Party was influencing this somehow, um, the scientists who are,
Everyone would say so.
yeah, the FBI would say so, or MI5 would say so, or one of the many intelligence agencies would say so. Of course, folks in the intelligence community know that that's not really what they do, and also they're affected by the exact same thing. This, wolf in sheep's clothing. That public health just isn't something you think about as being geopolitical. It's this very sort of innocent collaborative field that people go into it. They aren't thinking about geopolitics and competition and totalitarianism. They're thinking about how they can save lives, and that's why people go into public health. It's sort of the most innocent collaborative international field. And unfortunately, that is exactly what made it so appealing to the Chinese Communist Party. They've been colonizing it for many years now. Whether they had exactly this plan in mind, or if it was just sort of because they knew um, that because public health was so unexpected, that it was a sort of innocent field where you don't expect this type of geopolitical influence. They knew that they could sort of use public health as the perfect sort of propaganda piece. That these people are, you can almost say a bit gullible because um, doctors, they work in a collaborative field. They tend to be a little bit vulnerable to financial scams for that same reason. That they just are a bit unsuspecting about, fraud.
They're trusting.
Yeah, they're very trusting. At the same time, they enjoy a very, very high degree of trust from the public. So you can see if you're sort of a criminal mastermind, which frankly is what the Chinese Communist Party is, you can see how that's kind of the perfect conduit to turn lies into truth, the sort of perfect propaganda conduit by corrupting public health. And unfortunately, that's what we've seen over the past year. How do we combat that? Um, you know, a day at a time. I think in the short term, we have to shed light on what's actually happened here. Um, Once people are aware, it does seem like the narrative of the lockdown fraud is coming apart. More and more eyes are opening up. I'm getting, exponentially more followers by the day interested in how China has influenced this. People, the mainstream press, it's very clear that they're getting a bit nervous because people have just turned their backs on them and they're just so stubborn about not covering anything that goes against the narrative of these lockdowns being absolutely necessary. And there are multiple reasons for that. Some of that is their financing from China. Some of it is because, even more of their financing comes from corporations with financial interests in China. And they will report on things that are, universally known to be important. They actually do a fairly good job of reporting on China's human rights abuses. I think everybody knows that there's genocide going on there. And that's testament to that being very important to everybody. It'd be nice they actually did something. I mean, I think the fact that they're, you know, Chinese Communist Party is committing genocide should be more than enough reason to decouple. I really hoped we had learned that lesson from the 1930s, but apparently we have not. So, I mean, my work shouldn't really be necessary in that sense. We should already be decoupling from China for that reason alone, that they're committing genocide. But I think people need something that hits more closer to home to actually initiate that. And, the truth is in 2020, that's exactly what happened. This is something that affected everybody's lives. But so there's that financial interest from the Chinese Communist Party, financial interest from corporations, and also groupthink in itself. No journalist wants to step out of line because they don't see any other journalist stepping out of line. They see, talking about the lockdowns being really bad or talking about Chinese Communist Party influence on lockdowns, they see that as sort of a niche, sort of out there topic that, frankly, people like me write about, but mainstream journalists just don't. And that's the way it is. That's the narrative. And so there's some of that groupthink amongst them as well. They're in some ways even more vulnerable to it because they see themselves as responsible for being the mainstream. I think a lot of politicians see themselves that way as well from the conversations I've have with them. They see themselves as being responsible for sort of holding that center line, holding that narrative intact, and they feel like they can't step out of line. So that sort of makes them even more vulnerable to groupthink in that sense. So, make no mistake, even though the Chinese Communist Party was sort of but for cause, there's no question that they invented the idea of lockdown. Thus, it's axiomatic that the world would not be in lockdown if not for them. And they also, um, the fake science journals, seem to have influenced the data, seem to have launched the China propaganda campaign. But it's also groupthink. Dictatorships are excellent at using groupthink against people, using groupthink to control. So when people argue that, I just don't think that it's really China's influence so much. I think it's just, there's a lot of evidence that it's just groupthink. People are doing this because they see other people doing it. They see their peers doing it. They see especially their powerful peers who they want to impress doing it. That's absolutely true, but that's how all dictatorships work. All dictatorships work through groupthink. All dictators are in some ways, psychological masterminds of using and weaponizing groupthink to their own advantage of keeping themselves in power. So those two things are not mutually exclusive. Yes, it is, 90% groupthink, but yes, the Chinese Communist Party did sort of, in my mind, deliberately instigate that for their own ends.
So, have you read the book Red Notice by Bill Browder? Um, so it's a story about the how he fought after one of his attorneys, Magnitsky. So Magnitsky was killed by Putin's henchmen. He started this whole effort to go after the Magnitsky Act, and it's really defined his life. And he's fought for on behalf of this. So is this kind of where you kind of diverge in your life? Do you see this becoming your life's work, or are you just trying to put things kind of back in place and you're going to go on? I mean, you've taken on probably the most powerful regime in the world in some respects, and so how do you see this playing out personally?
I don't know where it's going to take me. I could see it going either way. I could see myself going back to normal, or I could see myself sort of dedicating myself to this. I will pursue this particular story for as long as it takes because to me this is the biggest crime of the century so far. That is, you only get so many exclamation points in life. This is my big exclamation point that Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party, just shut down the world. They did it, in my mind, deliberately, and now you have millions of starving children who would not be otherwise if it were not for this influence operation. That is a big deal. And until people know that, until that is common knowledge, I that's unacceptable to me living in a world where somebody might actually be able to get away with that. And to see journalists and elites covering for them is absolutely disturbing to me. I've lost, a lot of respect for people who I used to listen to. I had no reason not to. Like I said, I was kind of a New York Times economist reader. I had no reason not to trust those people. That's the people who, my parents' generation told me that, I should trust their judgment. They wrote very well. They have very good grammar. Um, they, seem to know a lot about different countries and about the world. And so, I'd listen to them and listen to their opinions. Uh, and I have lost a lot of respect for those writers now because they have not been willing. They have, given the circumstances when it behooved their interest, they have been turned into propaganda outlets very
Yeah.
deliberately by a totalitarian regime, I think. Um, they, to my knowledge, were not before, but that has been how powerful this deliberate fraud and psychological operation has been, by maintaining that big lie that this virus is exceptional and it requires these exceptional measures and this is all necessary. That's what our elites really want us to believe. They want us to all to go along with that, and especially the professional class. They want the professional class to really buy into that. And you know, you weren't, as a lawyer or as a doctor, you weren't really affected by this financially. So just do us a favor and pretend that this is all necessary. Pretend you don't see the data. Pretend you don't see all the fraud and propaganda that's taken place. And so we can just keep the sort of structure of things intact. And anyway, the stock market is fine anyway, so you should be okay. Um, that's not acceptable to me. I'm not going to rest and just let them get away with this crime that, to me was very deliberate on the part of probably a very small, powerful circle within Chinese Communist Party, maybe a handful of collaborators, and then from there spun into this big lie that the suspension of all human rights was necessary, and people have bought into that and essentially become criminals themselves. And that's what dictatorships excel at, is bringing out the evil in ordinary people, and that's what we see more and more of. And fortunately, I think people are waking up to that and realizing what's gone on here. And I think that that big lie is going to hopefully self-destruct very soon.
Well, I hope so. And Mike, I'd just like to say thank you. Thank you for educating me, because it was really your report that really allowed me to extend my sight deeper into what the Chinese Communist Party was doing. Thank you for coming on, generally speaking, and I appreciate your efforts. I'll keep supporting you on Twitter, and
Thank you.
And we'll post links to your Twitter account with this video, and look forward to talking to you again very soon.
Thanks so much, General. Yeah, your support has been invaluable. I think, we've only scratched the surface of what the Chinese Communist Party's influence has been on this pandemic response and in the world at large. So, I mean, there's much more to come, I'm sure.
I'm sure. Thank you so much.
Thanks, General.
Take care.
If you stayed to the end of this video, I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave comments below, like and subscribe so you can get access to notifications when the next video comes out. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Mike Senger. He's doing great work exposing the Chinese Communist Party's influence on our society. Thanks again for joining us with Generally Speaking. I'm General Spalding.